a long time. I think going back to my PhD study, he was about that same time doing a PhD on musky rat kangaroos. I think you were working with Helene Marsh, is that right? Mm-hmm. Helene, of course, who had many, many good students at JCU. And he then went on later to work on vertebrate seed dispersal. And he was based up on the Atherton tablelands. And he's now very actively engaged in the NRM group, which is based out of Atherton. And he's a key member for biodiversity, working a lot on greater gliders, mahogany gliders, sorry, the endangered mahogany gliders, of course, and also the Northern Bettong or tropical Bettong, which is highly endangered. So without further ado, thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks. Well, thanks for having me along. I guess I want to just start by situating myself in this story, I guess, and telling you a little bit about why I'm here. So I'm going to go back in time for a little bit and look at what I was doing 23 years ago. So 23 years ago, I had just finished my PhD. I was working as the threatened species coordinator for the area. And we had just started the Northern Bettong recovery team. And we were looking at the early days of threatened species recovery in Australia, I guess. So we wanted to figure out what we knew about the animals, what we needed to know about the animals, what the threats might be. And it was all pretty simple because those days we didn't actually know very much. So identifying the questions we needed to ask was quite easy. Because I was in PhD mode, I was pretty focused on research questions and trying to figure out what it was that we needed to know to recover the species. And apart from data deficiencies, there were also, of course, all the funding deficiencies of the time, and that was pretty minuscule. So last year in August, after 15 years in the health sector, I decided to come back into conservation research sector. And I've come in with natural resource management. So now I'm looking at the same threatened species because I was also working on mahogany gliders 23 years ago. And looking at all of the work that's been done during that intervening time, what we still don't know, all the gaps that have been filled and how that is being applied and how we need to go about applying that into the field for on-ground actions. And it's really nice to do that full circle from doing research to coming into actually implementing stuff on the ground. So before I go on to tell the stories of these two animals, I'll just do a quick overview of the whole threatened species industry. So in the beginning of a threatened species listing, we rely on really good evidence, and that's generally driven by researchers. You need to know what the taxonomy is, and there's actually a lot of species where a change in taxonomy makes a big difference to their threatened status. You need to understand where they occur and their full distribution. Their population trend can be important, and what are the threats to their survival. That information is usually quite technical and driven by scientists. It then goes into the realm of politics a little bit, into legislation. There's various legislative tools that we use to have species assessed. At the moment, we're using the common assessment method so that an animal can be assessed in any jurisdiction in Australia now. If they use this common assessment method, it will be automatically adopted by state and federal governments. And that's based on the IUCN system. Usually when an animal is first listed, you can also write a conservation advice, which gives us short-term guidance to what we need to do with that animal. Then we kind of move on to the recovery process and how to recover a species. And you move into creating a more detailed legislative document called a recovery plan, which has a lot more detail, a lot more actions, and usually involves a recovery team, but doesn't need to. It is also a much longer-winded process to get adopted into legislation. It requires public consultation, whereas a conservation advice does not. It can be put together by team of experts alone. So there's a few things there that a recovery planning process might include. Before I go on too much further, I just want to make it clear that a lot of what I'm presenting today isn't research that I've done. And I know that I'm not presenting everything that's been done on each of these species. There's bits that I've left out. And there's a lot of work and people that contribute to this that I may not mention, but their work is really highly valued anyway. I'm going to start with the Mahogany Glider. And you can see there listed the institutions that are involved with the Mahogany Glider recovery team. Both the animals I'm working with have very high functioning recovery teams, and they involve a high diversity of players with all sorts of different interests coming together. And they both work really well together. In the photo, wrong one. Here, there's Jackie Diggins, who started a lot of the Mahogany Glider work with terrain, and I'm carrying on her work. And Daryl there, who's with Whipskew Wildlife Preservation Society of Queensland, been involved for decades and doing a lot of good work. And a couple of Girrigan Rangers, who are also heavily involved in our work. And there's a big team of Girrigan Rangers that do a lot with us. The next photo along represents the new blood, who have all recently started and moved on with this work that Terrain is doing. And then down the bottom there, there's some of the community team members all working together in the Tully Council Chambers. So it's pretty important to have that really good team of people working together on what they're doing. Now, in the beginning of recovering a species and in the beginning of this sort of work, you need to just do the research on the basic ecology of the animal. And I'll show you a little further on how important that is and how that's applied on the ground. So this is a few graphs from Steve Jackson's work. He did a PhD with JCU back in the 90s. And so he's got really good data on the diet of the Mahogany Glider, the nectarivore. By the way, it's about 500 gram gliding possum. And it feeds on a few fruits, the arils of some wattle, a few insects, and a little bit of sap as well, but primarily nectar from a whole range of species of tree. You can see in the bottom right there, Steve has been able to look at when those resources are available to the gliders. And it's pretty good evidence, even just looking at that without knowing anything more about the gliders, that the gliders are going to need a fairly diverse habitat structure to be able to persist in the environment. If you look at that list of plant species, if anyone's familiar with them, it's quite a range, and they don't all occur in the same vegetation associations or vegetation types. So immediately we know the Mahogany Glider needs a complex mosaic in its habitat. So if we want to preserve it in the long term, we've got to maintain that mosaic where it can access all these resources. So it's a little bit of basic work there. Another one, a little bit of basic work that researchers would provide is looking at home range size. Mahogany gliders pair bond, and the home ranges are about 20 hectares. But the pair will occupy a slightly larger area. That pair will maintain that territory as well and keep other pairs away, though unpaired individuals will move through. So there's also a graph there on the bottom right showing you their foraging distances on a night. So they move quite a lot through the night. So we're looking at an animal that needs a fairly big area to be able to move through to access all those food resources that they need and to maintain its breeding territories. And then many of those animals living in what would be a viable population size. So we're looking that we need a fair area for this animal to occupy. Some of the other work that was done with Mahogany gliders early on was looking at models of their distribution. So if we go right back to the beginning with Steve Van Dyke, who first rediscovered the Mahogany Glider I was hoping some of you might be familiar with the story of the mahogany glider, but it was collected in the late 1800s, and a specimen sat in a drawer and it was filed with the sugar gliders. And one day Steve Van Dyke was sorting drawers and found this giant sugar glider in the drawer. Said, "That's not a sugar glider." So he looked at the location where it was found in the museum. So Steve Van Dyke was with the Queensland Museum, sorry. So he went up to that location, that type locality, and looked for it and found it. And that was its rediscovery in 1989. So between its first sighting and specimen collection, until then it had been forgotten. Some stories online say it was presumed extinct, but it never was, it just was forgotten. So a little while later, Steve Jackson came along to continue Steve Van Dyke's original work, and further developed the model of where you might look for this animal and where its habitat might exist. He went through a second iteration with better data there. And then along came Erin Cheng, who's currently doing her PhD with JCU in Townsville under Conrad Hoskins' guidance. And she's developed a new model, which is just adding more information to our understanding of the distribution of this animal. We don't need to look at the detail there. The photograph is of my team on Hinchinbrook Island. Because Hinchinbrook Island, some of the forests there are modelled as good habitat for the mahogany glider. So we've gone over there and had a quick look. 20 cameras for 6 weeks was all, but didn't get anything except a sugar glider. So, but it was pretty fun. And Erin spent a little bit of time testing areas that have not been looked in before and hasn't turned up any new populations yet. So it looks like we've got a fairly solid understanding of its distribution, which is from Tully south to Ollara Creek near Townsville, about 220 kilometres distance along the coastal woodland forests. So not a big distribution, quite a restricted animal, and relying on obviously a complex mosaic of habitats. So that was just a quick flash past of some of the basic research that JCU has provided, but others as well, that has gone into the work that Terrain's doing now. So what you see, and we're going to see a few of these, is off our mapping tool, which is just a GIS tool. Wrong one. If we just look at this one, Steve Jackson divided the vegetation types that the mahogany gliders occur in into 5 major types based on what resources were available in each. And it actually lumps together multiple regional ecosystems. I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with regional ecosystem classifications. So they're a broad generalization of a vegetation association rather than the detailed one in this diagram. But they're meaningful to the mahogany glider. So the pale one, which is the mixed open forest, has one subset of the resources from their diet, but not others. Some of that's in the mixed woodland. There's a pale blue one there called emergence, and that's a habitat type that's classified as some resources for mahogany gliders are remaining as emergence above a rainforest invasion. So mahogany gliders can still use it, but it's limited in what resources it can provide. So the graph on the right, the map on the right that you can see is one of these critical linkages to legislation. That's the essential habitat model for mahogany gliders from the state government. It's based on the habitat modelling done by Steve Jackson and others, and it's put into a simplified single layer. If any development or anything happens within that vegetation type, then it triggers the legislation. Both the state and federal legislation responds, and certain hoops have to be jumped through, and people have to go and investigate what impact that might have on a threatened species, the mahogany glider. So these are important layers to have available for managers. We're still looking at vegetation here. So if we look at the graph on the map on the left, you can see these little areas of red highlight there. Those are mapped areas of vegetation thickening. Some of it's thickening with weeds, some of it's with rainforest invasion, and some of it's with sclerophyll thickening, like tea trees becoming too dominant. But what it means is that the habitat is on a trajectory that is not conducive to mahogany glider persistence. So all of these maps are done based on aerial photographs and ground truthing as well, to make sure that we actually know, well, Steve knew what he was talking about. The map on the right is looking at fire frequency. And that was done using fire scar data as well as QPWS burning records and whatnot. So the yellow is underdone, not frequent enough fires to maintain the habitat in the right condition. The green is good, and the red is where the fires are a little too frequent, and there's not much of that on that lowland tropical coast. So one of the other things that Steve has looked at more recently is critical corridors. And on the left, you can see mapped corridors to maximize gene flow. So mahogany glider population is broken into 5 major subpopulations. Each subpopulation is separated from the other subpopulation by a distance of greater than 150 meters. So a glider cannot walk across the ground. So they have to be able to glide from one tree to another or one something to another to be able to catch the next patch of habitat. So if there's a break bigger than 100 meters, the maximum glide distance is 100 meters, that's been recorded. Average is 60, average for a good glide is a 60-meter glide. So any breaks in their habitat, and we saw how broken up their habitat looks, bigger than that, it's a disjunction in their distribution and they can't pass through it. So left is gene flow. On the right, we have looked at all of those corridors and categorized them as investment priorities. So that's based on which are the most important patches of habitat to link, which ones are most feasible, least cost pathways, and which ones, yeah, a whole lot of parameters gone in there to prioritize where we need to invest the money to reconnect those or keep those connections live. And we'll have a look at some of the work we've done there in a minute. So something that's really, really important, and on this side here, is location data. Every scientist here who works on an animal, by law, with their QPWS permit, has to submit all of their location data for every animal that they've caught. And it goes into a central database called WildNet. We won't go into all the problems with WildNet, but it's essential to get all that data in there because it triggers legislation. That data goes onto a thing called a trigger map. If any development or clearing proposal or anything goes within a 5-kilometre radius of a location record of a threatened species, the legislation is triggered and it's put on pause until it's investigated to see what effect that's going to have. So I'm going to just say, make sure you get your data in, it's really critical. So this is the data for mahogany gliders over a few decades, and it's just color-coded by decade. So looking at all those previous maps we've glimpsed at, putting together with the distribution of the gliders, we have also prioritized every piece of land for management. Now, something I hadn't said already is that mahogany glider habitat is now broken up. It's 50% gone from clearing, and what remains is in 998 fragments. So a lot of that's on private land in agricultural areas. So we've mapped every single piece of habitat that is in a fragment somewhere or on a private property. And we have prioritised which are the most important places to put our resources based on all that ecological information, gene flow information, and everything else we can get, and where the mahogany gliders are found. So that's a really important resource for us to be able to target our work. But it's also really important for other players in the field, and there's a lot of private landholders who are really keen to do conservation. And when someone comes to us, we can guide them as to whether that, what they can contribute. So there's just a few little polygons here, and this was only updated last April, so it's a year behind, almost a year behind. The little colourful polygons you can see in these two areas. So this is the southern area and the northern area. Places where terrain, this project has done on-ground work, either to link corridors, to replant, or do some burning to manage the habitat. So this is where the mahogany glider resources are being spent at the moment. So terrain works very closely with the recovery team and all of the members of the recovery team. And this is the sort of work we're doing now. So I'll go through some of those things. So if we just look at connections to start with, on this diagram, I mentioned that mahogany gliders glide average 60 metres, and they have a 2-to-1 ratio drop. There's some work Steve Jackson did. So that's been critical in designing a glide pole. So we're now putting in poles, or have been for a while, to allow gliders to glide across roads and other places. An example of a glide pole is over here in the field. It looks just like the drawing. Whenever we put a glide pole in, if there's a barbed wire fence nearby, then the barbs are covered as well, so that any glider that misses the pole doesn't hit the barbs on the fence. And of course, that's a standard one crossing a road. And that one, if you can see the little squiggly red and yellow lines, the priority corridors for gene flow on our maps. You can see 2 yellow arrows. What we're trying to do here is make sure that large block of habitat, it's isolated on the coast, is being able to be connected to the base of the ranges, where there's a much more larger patch of habitat in the lowland part of the ranges. So most of those bits have got vegetation running along them, but you can see here there's a highway, and we need to connect across that highway. If we just zoom in a bit closer, if you look at that highway connection, it's pretty, whoops, wrong one. It's pretty wide just here. It's got a railway connection as well. It's more than the 60 metres that we want to cross. So we have put in glide poles in another location just a little bit further north, connects the same sets, just a bit more of a wriggly route. So those 2 blue dots represent some of those glide poles, and they're being used currently by gliders getting across that break in their habitat. They wouldn't be able to get across without them. Similarly, this one was a really fun experiment. In the same landscape, we had a big break between a fragment that had mahogany gliders in it, totally isolated, and then the rest of the habitat. And the Girrigan Rangers put in for a grant, and they got a grant to do a 9-pole crossing to see if gliders would cross 9 poles across a paddock. And lo and behold, there's the crossing in the field. There's some of the design work up in the top right there, just to space the poles, make sure they were going to work and be able to be reached. And then we put in these collars. If we look at the photo down the bottom there, there's a collar on the pole. The glider's supposed to land below the collar and then come up through the hole in the collar and get photographed. So we had that on every single pole across the paddock, and every single pole got photographs of gliders. So they, within 2 weeks, we're using those 9 poles to cross that paddock and reconnect with the other population, which is pretty exciting. I mean, there's not many animals you can do that sort of thing with. The other really nice thing about this particular work is that it's a collaboration between Ergon, Main Roads and Queensland Rail and the councils, and they generally pay for all of the poles. Ergon provides the poles and erects them, and if it's across the road, Main Roads does all their work. If it's across a railway line, QR gets involved. And right now, we're pushing for a big project where TMR, Main Roads, Queensland Rail and Ergon have a 5-year rolling program where they put poles every year when they're doing work in their budget to fill in all of these corridor gaps across their infrastructure. Can't do that with every animal, unfortunately. Another way we're doing reconnections is with replanting of woodland habitat. And we have an example. The photo in the middle was about a month ago where they were spraying the grass to do the replanting. And then on the right there is the Girrigan Ranges. We contracted to go in and do a planting of, we've got about 3,000 trees in the ground there now. And we're basically, the property owners here filling in all of the cow paddocks, which are forming a break between the base of the ranges and Mahogany Glider habitat there, and then another long tongue of habitat that connects another range. So they're getting rid of their cattle. They're down to 10 and gone blank, but anyway. And so it's involved not just the landholders, but the Girrigan Rangers do the planting, but they also have a nursery. They're growing the plants. Hinchinbrook Shire are growing plants, and Cassowary Coast are growing plants for us too. But the landholders, I must say, are amazing. The planting, that photo is 2 weeks ago. You know how hot it's been. And the landholders have been watering 2,057 plants by hand since then. So go landholders. That's Deb and Royd, by the way. One of the other aspects of this program with the Mahogany Gliders, the best conservation is always to preserve what we've already got. So we're doing quite a lot of work with quite a few players to find land, unallocated state land, whatever, people who want to put on conservation agreements, but do strategic protection and acquisition of land throughout Mahogany Glider range. And we have all of that data now to say, okay, where are the strategic blocks that we need to get to connect? And it's all voluntary. There's no top-down approach. It's all looking at what we can do. And I must say most of the community is really on board. They're really into looking after their animals. So a lot of players in that space as well. We try and keep the profiles of the animals up as part of this program. So the Hinchinbrook survey was a good hook for the media. So we put out a bit of a media release. We ended up getting into the Guardian's top 5 reads for 2021. And the Guardian has a distribution of 88.1 million around the world. So it's nice to get the news and the stories out there. And they did quite a good job on it too. Another component of the work we're doing on the ground now, based on all that work that Steve and others have done, we know where to burn and why to burn it and how frequently to burn it. So the Girrigan Rangers, working with Department of Resources and us to do an ecocultural burn program. There's a few names there, Matani Forest, Beach Lily Creek. That's the ones that were supposed to be done last year, but it rained. We're doing those again next. But we're also each year adding more properties to burn, focusing on trying to push rainforest invasion back out of the habitat and improve long-term survival. We're also engaged with the CSIRO. They have a monitoring, evaluation, research pilot network. Some of our Mahogany Glider sites are going into that. So we burnt those last year, and now we're not allowed to burn them for 2 years while we monitor the changes in the vegetation. I just want to give a quick plug to QBWS and Department of Resources, because most of the Mahogany Glider habitat is theirs to manage, and they're doing a fantastic job of getting in every year and getting the fires right and supporting the likes of Girrigan and us to also get our fires right. And I won't go into the insurance problems that we've been having. One of the really valuable things that we've been able to do with a really functional recovery team who all provide their data, and all these researchers who publish it so that it's accessible and in the public arena already, is put it together into those tools, the GIS tools we were looking at before. We actually send the data for those layers to the councils. They're now adding it to their own internal layers, GIS systems. So when they've got someone going out to clear a drain or chop down a eucalypt tree because it's too close to a drain, they can check if it's in a critical Mahogany Glider corridor on their little tablet on their hand in the field. And that way they know exactly when they should pause and contact their environmental guy and say, this is the Mahogany Glider corridor. Should I chop that tree down? Those guys told me to, but and then they can go and look at whether or not they need to do something about stabilising the tree, replacing it with a glide pole or whatever. And I must say, Cassowary Coast Council are putting in some glide poles for us in the very near future. So there's a whole lot of those data layers that have come originally from researchers, translated through terrain systems, going back out to be used on the ground, which is really nice. The other thing we do a lot of is work with traditional owner groups. So a component of what we do is training, and that's often with QPWS and Department of Resources and others. And the long-term goal is that these guys will continue to manage most of that country long after our funding ceases, which is mid-year next year. So we have to make sure the skills and teams are available and ready to do that. So that was Mahogany Glider. I better speed up a bit and get through the Northern Bettongs a bit faster. So the Northern Bettongs, I've already mentioned, I started with those quite a long time ago now. But once again, they have a really high functioning, really good recovery team with a whole heap of people engaged and involved and all actively engaged and collaborating really well. And it's really nice to see. And it makes the work so much easier. Now, I should have said earlier, but I've stolen these images and data from everywhere and all over the place. Some of them I've named, some of them I forgot to. But this is the historical distribution of the Northern Bettong. Plus there was one location about 800 kilometres to the southeast in the Dawson Valley, which is the original location they were found. They were seen there once and then they blinked out there. And then they were found up here again. This was, except for the middle isolated dot there, 20 years ago, all of those populations were still in existence. Now, three of those are gone. So, two more of those have gone. So the Ravenshoe population blinked out about 60 years ago, Tara Vale and Mount Windsor only in the last decade or so. So it's pretty dire straits for these guys. So we're down to two populations. Again, a whole lot of basic research was required to start understanding what's going on. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, the likes of Carl Vernessen from JCU and Lisa Pope from UQ were doing the basic ecology, fire ecology and genetics and reproductive work. Bettongs have a bit of a varied diet, but they love truffles, so ectomycorrhizal fungi, and they've got really nice long fingernails there to dig up truffles, and that's a bunch of truffles from Davies Creek on the right. So other people have done quite a bit more work. Sandra Abel, who is also involved in all of this, but they've demonstrated that Northern Bettongs are a pretty critical truffle spore disperser. So there's a whole community of animals that do it, but the Northern Bettongs disperse a wider range of species, and they're probably more reliable throughout the year as a disperser of truffle spores. They also tend to disperse a lot more of those that associate with eucalypt trees, in the habitats they're in. So they're kind of maintaining their own habitat to a degree. The graph there on the right just shows that the top there, the Northern Bettong, it contributes the most to the number of species that are being moved around by those animals in a community. So we know about their diet, we know they're a critical landscape architect in some way. Some people would like to call it a keystone species. There's arguments for and against that one. We also have a pretty good understanding of their home ranges and movements already, well, after quite a long time now. And there's been a lot of work done by quite a few different people. And in recent times, Chris Pockney's been doing some more of this work and some more of their fire ecology into more detail than has been done previously. So onto that fire ecology, we've got a good idea of how bettongs respond to fire, whether they survive it, what fires are bad, what frequencies of fires are good for the truffles, and what's good to maintain the habitat. We're also getting a pretty good idea of how to push rainforest invasion back out of their habitat, which national parks have been doing a great job of in the Lamb Range in the last 20 years. Because I was looking at it 23 years ago, I can go up there now and go, wow, they've really made a difference. This habitat is looking fantastic, and they've really got rid of lantana. Well, we got rid of the grazing first, then the lantana, and now the rainforest is being pushed back. So it's really good work that's going on there. Really nice, and you can see in the landscape photo, really nice fine scale mosaic burns. There's a really good guide there that WWF and JCU had and QBWS have had a hand in about how to manage fire in their country. Here's the little distribution area here on the Lamb Range is thanks to Stephanie from JCU, and it outlines her model of where the Northern Bettong population is likely to be, the full extent of it on the Lamb Range at the moment. But the graph on the right there, each bar of a different colour is a different year, which is outlined down the bottom. And what's really nice about this graph is it demonstrates that the Lamb Range population of Northern Bettongs has remained stable over 20 years or so. Maybe gone up a little, but I wouldn't bet on it. But it's just fantastic to have that long-term research going on, being contributed to year after year. And we can go, okay, we have one stable population of bettongs, and that's really good to know. And we've really got to look after them. And I think that's happening now. So in the early days of the Northern Bettong work, we wanted to see, we modelled their habitat and looked at where else they might be, and we went out looking for them. We found them only in those places that were listed on the original map. And then after the first recovery plan was written, Scott Burnett and John Winter went out and had another look. But that's quite a while ago now. And more recently, WWF and a whole raft of other players have gone out and done a huge amount of work resurveying a lot of their predicted habitats, huge effort. And basically they confirmed that they're in the Lamb Range, and they reconfirmed that they still exist at Mount Spurgeon, up near Mount Carbine. They've blinked out of the Windsor Tablelands, and they've gone from Taravale. And all the other possible places in between, there's no record, and that was a big effort. So I'm pretty confident that we know exactly where they are now, and this is some AWC data from Mount Spurgeon, Mount Lewis National Park, Mount Spurgeon National Park. Tiny little population. You can see all the open circles, camera traps that didn't get any bettongs, and the red ones are camera traps that did get bettongs. So it's a really restricted distribution there, and we have a pretty good understanding of exactly where they are. On the left there is the camera grid and cage trapping grid in yellow, where AWC have been doing quite a bit of work with the Western Yalangii. So this just kind of reinforces that over a bit of time and a bit of examination, we're confirming that it's a tiny population restricted to a tiny area up there. and not a lot of individuals. So what does that mean? There was a population viability analysis done, which focused mainly on what would happen if cats started eating more baby bettongs, and they would crash and burn real quick, basically. But the good thing about this scenario is that AWC's work has demonstrated there's not actually that many cats up in those little populations, so they're probably not going to be a big issue. I think there was only one cat on a camera trap, was all. But what's probably more important is that there's a strong negative correlation between, and if we look at the dots over on the right there, the red dots are where bettongs are found and their relative abundance by the dot size. Blue dots are where cattle were found in camera traps, relative abundance by dot size. Exactly the same pattern with pigs. There was only 4% overlap between the distribution of bettongs and the distribution of cattle to pigs in the same trapping grid. So obviously, whatever the reason might be, they're mutually exclusive. Similar pattern for lantana. Doesn't that look like fun, getting through that? The bettongs don't like foraging in lantana thickets. And there's one individual who was up there who would go through the lantana thicket, forage for a while on the far side and come back through and forage on the other side. So obviously there's three big problems in this tiny little population that should be easy to manage. Get rid of the cattle, get rid of the pigs, get rid of the lantana. It's the sort of on-ground work we need to be doing real fast. So that population is just circled on the map there, roughly where it is. And the graph on the right is the estimated population size. If you look at the little lower box, you see in August 2020, they calculated there were 70 animals in that population, and that dropped to 44 in April. It's pretty severe, serious situation for an animal to be in when you've got an isolated population like that in those low numbers. And what you would expect is presented here in more AWC data, which is that the reproductive output of the Mount Lewis or sturgeon population, which is in that tan or fawn bars, is much lower than that in the lamb range, where there's a healthy big population, which is in the blue bars. So females produce young regularly in a healthy, genetically healthy population, and not in an inbred population. So this suggests inbreeding depression. And there's also been a bunch of work done with genetics. So in the early days, Lisa Pope's work showed that there's quite strong structuring. This is the big dots on the left, structuring in the population, including significant differences across the lamb range. So there's barriers to movement across the lamb range. Stephanie's new work, which is still underway, and I'm sure she's going to do some really cool analyses with that, shows that the sturgeon population is different. The lamb range population is a big conglomerate, but she reflects similar structuring to what Lisa found. So there's natural barriers across that population, which potentially gives us some tools and ways to work with this. And AWC are looking to do a translocation down to Taravale and reintroduce them to where they once occurred. And having that genetic data and knowledge and understanding population viability, we can know how many animals to take from which gene patches to make it the most viable population. And there's also the potential to do a genetic rescue up to Mount Sturgeon and introduce animals to the north to try and improve their reproductive output up there once we get the cattle and pigs and lantana out. So it's pretty amazing work that's gone into this. And I'm just going to briefly mention what Terrain's doing. What Terrain often likes to do is work outside the protected area estate, because QPWS are doing such a good job in there. And so we're trying to support landholders along the edges. The figure there shows the predicted modelled habitat for bettongs on the edge of the national park. So there's quite a lot of private land where the bettongs occur. So Terrain's project is looking at how we can support those landholders to manage their habitat for bettong habitat conservation when they want to. A recent thing we've been dealing with is roadkills. Last year there were 8 road deaths, probably represents about 1% of the population of a threatened species. So we kind of want to minimise that. So we've been working with Main Roads. They're really on board and supportive, and we're looking at options for road signs at the moment. We're probably going to have to go with the giant Care for Our Wildlife sign, which is much bigger than the others, and it'll just have a bettong on it instead of a koala. Okay. We're also providing support to the recovery team, and we've got a conservation advice underway to start replacing the very old recovery plan. We will then work over the next few years to renew the recovery plan. The really sad part of this story is that both these species are worse off than they were 20 years ago, despite all the efforts of research and on-ground efforts that are going on. The Mahogany Gliders, probably entirely due to Cyclone Yasi, knocked the habitat for 6, and the number of captures on cameras and cage traps is way less than it was before Cyclone Yasi. Still, 10 years later, they still haven't recovered. So we're not sure where they're at. We don't have a good population estimate, but it's concerning. There's some areas where they're doing well, so they're not about to blink out, but they're not as good as they were before Cyclone Yasi. For the bettongs, we've lost a few populations, probably due to inbreeding depression and pressures of those cattle and pigs and lantana and fire regimes going haywire. So where to from here? One thing I haven't mentioned the whole time. We're facing a big threat that's threatening a lot of our species habitats, phenology, resources, fire, all the things that these animals are relying on in the wet tropics are going to be changing. Plus inundation along the coast will mean that animals will have to move through the landscape better. So just in closing, I think the phase we're at now is there's a whole lot of actions already ongoing that need to be completed, like the translocations, like all the connections for Mahogany Gliders. But we have to start thinking at a much broader landscape scale. We have to start looking at resilience in the landscape. We need to look at, what's it called? There's a graph theory, resistance across the landscape as well. Which is all to do with connectivity, where animals are going to need to move, what's happening with phenology of flowering and fruiting and fungus. And we also need to manage these animals at a metapopulation scale rather than at individual parks, and get stud books and captive breeding and stuff like that going now. And we need the whole community engaged, and in these 2 cases they are. So there's time for a few questions.